Good
Good
evening.
evening.
How you doing? Good
I'm
morning.
just catching up the last 10 minutes that I missed last week.
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh,
so
10 minutes after you left. It did seem like we hung
to
around.
to assist your 834 item of research and not particularly tyrannical, I've dropped into the community chat my picture of Admiral Genghis, one of 200 plus jokes,
Oh, thank you.
versus that ragtale of a genocidal trick.
Right. Santa Maria. Yeah, I used that in I used that in my class. Oh, there it is. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
It looks like it's in a
It's not.
library. What is that? Is that just is that a,
Oh, that's in a shopping mall.
okay, it's beautiful.
It's not there at the moment, but the shopping mall is a relatively old one called Ibn Battuta Mall. And
Oh, okay.
each of the
After
main
the
sections
famous traveler, sure.
go across his travels across the Muslim world.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly that's Chinese junk. So it's in the Chinese section.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this lovely Forbidden City red Chinese beam section where they do the stacking of the capital. They don't do solid capitals like the Greeks. They do those oversized, jungy type
Mm-hmm.
wooden block stacks.
Interesting.
And then as you go through, there's China, Mongol, India, Persia, Egypt, something, and then Andalusia. So the Egyptian is a bit fakey because it's all a bit painted as though it's like, Ramses II type stuff.
Yeah.
But the Persian one is virtually slap in the middle of the whole length. And it's also where there's a big T junction that goes out of the mall to the metro station.
Mm-hmm.
And that center point is a big Persian dome like you would get in Samarkand or similar.
Mm.
And it's probably the other piece that's photographed most. And that whole piece is just a circulation space with a couple of coffee shops surrounded by other clothing shops.
Mm.
And the colour change from one space to another is pretty huge. And then periodically, there are sort of like museum exhibits about Ibn Battuta.
Mm.
His journey, his pair up with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And then things like similar type of navigational material.
Oh, technologies, yeah. So does he pair up in the mall? Does he pair up with Antonio Banderas in the 13th Warrior?
No,
that's supposed to be too, isn't it?
It's a linear building. I mean, it goes from China to Andalusia. Sorry, China to Andalusia, from China, India, and the junction is in Persia. So almost all of the T pieces. They have extended it. They have extended it recently.
He went to sub-Saharan Africa too. Did he go to Mali?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's not really a Berber section, as it were, and there's certainly no African section. But it comes up in all the displays with the routes and maps and machines. There's a resident. We have an astronaut. We don't have a star dome with a projector in quite the same way as you would get in a planetarium. Like a paid planetarium. We have similar, but we have an area that is surrounded by big tall trees and is a dark area within the city. And there's a couple of big fixed telescopes or big available telescopes. And the guy who runs that every now and then does free public talk things. And one of his was, how did Ibn do his navigation? And they've got Creaver Sextant type navigation. They have a ruler and a stick with knots in it. And the combination of the two things means you can navigate around sort of all the Arab areas, so all the way across the Indian Ocean and back again.
Wow.
And he did that the first time I saw him do that. He did that in a different shopping mall that had a big dome area that was surrounded at that point with Arabic architectural type space. That was an awful lot of local type jewelry shops, mostly, but not exclusively so. And in this big open area, they had the American exhibit. as in they had a Diplodocus from Wyoming on a stand explaining what a Diplodocus was.
Okay.
And oddly enough, that area has been refurbed now, and the dome that was solid is now lifted up higher and is now glass. And to get that work done, they moved Dippy out to one of the normal sort of stretches of the Mall, which was nice because the original domed area, people access was only at the ground floor. There was no balcony. So you couldn't get up to see into the dinosaur. Where he is now and he's rearranged in a slightly different pose. Maybe she, I'm not quite sure we know how to sex him. And so you can almost touch the head. And it's about this big, and it's like 80 foot long and 30 foot high, and it's clearly one of those that would have helped them with the idea that let's have a second brain in the tail.
Sure.
So, and other thing to add before you explain your 834 was particularly Chris's anxiety trip, and clearly they need to go and see his GP for some drugs to calm him down. I too feel that in spite of us trying to mix it up a lot, with the odd bit of climate change and the odd bit of note taking and stuff, we are doing ourselves a bit of disservice by doing not quite back to back, but very close themes. We're already talking about pirates again. We've done pirates, right? In the whole gamut of what we could do. There is a guy who used to work for USAID, who never doesn't work for USAID, and he has been running a look at this book type page on Facebook. And he puts up between 1 and 10 books a week. And there's no reading club attached, but now there is. And he also, within that 1 to 10 books, periodically did a theme. And the current theme he's just about to finish, which was officially March's theme from memory, was something along the lines of why did Europe dominate versus Islam? And there were a couple of books in that listing that I thought would do us very well. So if there's any positive or any thoughts that you might want to trickle down the list, I mean, I think his list is now like 3,000 or 4,000 titles. Most of them are Islamic written in terms of or at least they are Islamic named. They're not necessarily Islamic because they could be. One of the books he's brought up recently was about all of the Jews that stayed underground in the Ottoman Empire. Outwardly, they were practicing Muslims, but inwardly, they were practicing Jews. And they didn't sort of materially disappear until the Ottoman Empire disappeared.
And this would be sort of contemporary with the Spanish Inquisition?
No, this was right up to the end of the empire.
Okay.
It was the first one.
Okay.
There are a good number of. The book cover's got a photograph of a Turkish pasha, Fezhat, an Islamic, inside the house clothed woman. But it happens to be a Jewish family. And they practice inside the house and or with their neighbours that they know are Jewish. They practice whatever the Jewish practices are, versus they're not looking toward, they're not bowing towards sacrifice.
That's interesting.
They have to go and do it once in a while.
Yeah.
And I thought there's a good crossover with, there are all those perverted Easter or whatever they called them. That both Muslims and Jews converted back to Christianity in Spain in the early days.
Right. It's interesting. I was just looking at, I didn't read it, but I noticed, I just subscribed to the Ground News recently, which is supposed to give you both sides and all of that and tell you where, the left is not talking about stories and the right is and things like that. And I didn't look at it, but I remember, if I can't find it right now, but there was a story about people, about this country adjacent to Iran where they are emulating Persian culture, but not Shiite Islam. which I thought was an interesting distinction to make. So maybe I'll go, maybe I'll go back and, maybe that's a theme that's kind of percolating up into the air right now. This idea that there are cultural elements that aren't maybe 100% necessarily Islamic elements of these cultures that are relevant.
Well, that was one of the interesting things too about the weird hypothesis
Mhm.
is the the economic model tended to break down the extended family in addition to other cultural pieces that split us out and kept you from having a big extended family
Right.
and focused more on the individual mom and dad and kids and pet as
Yeah.
separate from all the rest. And it's also become a lot easier to move around the country to go somewhere else to do something else,
Mhm.
which everybody thinks is just an easy thing to do now. But still, I think the vast majority of America wants to live close to family.
Mhm.
And in my case, in the last 3 months, it's been really great having at least one family member six
Oh, yeah.
miles away from our house.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's funny. We were talking about family kind of the end, or I think the end last week. And I thought coming away from it, I thought, well, it's that whole, it's the whole, it's not, it had something was echoing in my brain about the whole kind of the idea of, well, it's not personal, it's strictly business, that kind of Godfather thing
Yeah.
as well. But the family thing is interesting because we had, especially in the post World War II era, we had this idea that the American dream had something to do with focusing on the nuclear family rather than the extended family, right? Going away to college, following a career trajectory that would require you to take a job in order to move up in a corporation, for example. You would take a job in a faraway city, and that would be the obvious choice that people would want to make, right, would be to sort of follow that trajectory rather than, I mean, even to the extent that, my two batches of kids that I have, right, my two slightly different generations of kids, the first two were born in the early 90s. And there was every 100% expectation that they would go away and they would do the thing, they would become independent sometime between 18 and whenever it was that they finished their undergraduate career, right? And we told one of my daughters that we were paying for her undergraduate, but she was on her own for the grad school, and she was in a 5-year, direct to master's kind of a program, and she transitioned during that period. And they're both living, they're still both living out east, and so we don't have that. And the second batch, there seems to not be that expectation. The second batch were born in the, about 10 years later in the early 2000s, and that seems to be a different. It's not obvious that they will leave. It's not a given that they're going away to college, they're going away, we're splitting the whole thing. I mean, now obviously since then the family has actually split and I'm no longer living there, but it was kind of weird that expectation that had just been sort of a given. I think, starting with the generation that probably my parents were in, right? Who are what, the silent? Is that what they are? They're just before the boom. So they were too young to be in the war, but they were alive during the war. I think they're called the silent generation. They're not the greatest generation because they didn't do the war.
Well, I'm kind of curious too, because that expectation dramatically shifted in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because roughly up until the 1900s, like 99% of the population on the planet were subsistence farmers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it wasn't until after that that the shift became a thing and people started moving into big cities and away from farms and doing other things besides farming or subsistence,
Mm-hmm.
gathering for their daily food.
Yeah, and I think it begins in the middle of the 19th century in Europe, right? Which is why you get, like 1848, the year of revolutions and all that. But then they all come to America and they settle in cities and they start doing all of those things that lead to labor action and Haymarket and all of that.
Well, it's like at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution really is what kicks that shift off. And even then if you were we could frame it in a COVID work from home perspective. You had a spinning wheel at home, so you were working in the home and churning out things to send off. Well,
Right.
eventually all those home-based jobs disappeared because they moved into factories in the city.
Yeah.
And were done in just mass
Right.
quantity.
Right. Well, and there's an intermediate period of putting out that we've sort of forgotten about, right? Where there was kind of piecework that was done in people's homes, before it all got kind of consolidated in these factories. But it's interesting that that I was talking to my students because I'm at about that in my U.S. history course. And I was talking to my students this week about the idea that that clocks and timing and what they call bell time in the mill towns up in the Northeast, right, was a whole different thing. And I tried to get them to imagine, being a farmer, and am I going to fix the fence today, or I'll do it, early next week. Am I going to? That there were things that needed to be done, but there was a whole lot more kind of self-determination about it. If you're an artisan, right, and I'm going to finish the thing, early. I'm going to finish the thing quick so that I can get paid, right? But those are all, sort of choices that are within the agency of the actual person who's involved, and that completely changes once we get, the bell ringing and
the thing that strikes me on it, of course, is there is about a 4-minute time difference between London and Bristol.
Right.
If you do a pure solar clock. And somewhere in the browsing this today on this there was a woman apparently who had a good fog watch, and because not everybody could hear the bell, confirmed midday, so everybody reset their old-fashioned inaccurate clocks every day at noon. Because London being on the meridian, basically, she went around on a bicycle and gave a lot of the newspaper and the traders and the dealer type people that were very important on time a clock check during the day. But it was that the agreement on time for the day-to-day person was the railway timetable. Because you didn't care about a horse-drawn wagon stroke stagecoach so much, because that's a very variable one. Whereas the mechanism of the steam train and the track meant your journey could be timetabled. So it all got very tight.
Mm. Once you're at risk of missing something that's going to leave without you, then that becomes that also kind of lights a fire under people.
Yeah, the train is not going to wait for you, but the stagecoach might.
Right.
Well, not to drag us back on the topic, but that idea of the train is leaving without you, I think, on this caste idea is what's, really, and not, as we have talked throughout multiple books over the last 2 years, I have been looking for what's the quiet reason so much of America has split off and has literally gone crazy and seeming to vote against their interest. And it's been hiding there all along, but Wilkerson, hit me over the head with a frying pan this week of, we're trying to keep the white power balance in check. And that literally is one of the biggest driving factors for why we would vote against everything it's ever meant to be an American, because we have to keep this hierarchy, and we think it's a zero-sum game. And if they're better than us, then we can't, we have no identity left.
Right.
And if you could catch a train system like you've got in Europe, well, you're really screwed. Because you could jump on a train, you don't need a plane, you don't need a passport, you don't need to pre-book your ticket, you don't get searched by TSA or whoever it is.
Well, it's even throughout history, there's I wish I could remember the name of the medievalist who told me, because we were talking about travel one day, and she said, in the medieval period, it's easier to reframe and think about history with a 1-6-23 rule. And the distance you can travel by ship in a day is roughly equivalent to how far you can ride a horse in 6, which is roughly equivalent to about how far you can travel by foot in 23 days. And if you think about that and you draw, and particularly with British history and European history, particularly along the coasts, so it's a whole lot easier for the Scandinavians to invade Britain because they can travel by ship and they can do it almost instantaneously.
Right.
And they can do it putting horses on the ship so that once they get there, they can move and go quickly. Versus if you're a peasant farmer and you've got to walk, it's much further, but it's easier for the Brythonic languages to move from Britain into Brittany on the coast of France because sea travel and trade is real quick there.
You're muted, Tim. You're muted.
the move from Great Britain to Lesser Britain, the English Empire, Brexit #1, the Plantagenet Empire, Brittany, yeah, which is why they've got the same sort of Stone Age stuff as UK.
Yep. Well, and in between the Stone Age and then you also got the
Channel
Vikings,
Island.
right, kind of coming down to, and we've been sort of focused quite a bit, I guess, with Ukraine being central to our lives right now, on the idea that, the Varangians, came down to Kiev, but they also crazily went into the Mediterranean, attacked, failed in their attack of Byzantium, but then entered the Black Sea, and so so were able to make their way to Crimea and to Ukraine from the water as well. So, it's kind of interesting. It's weird. Another thing that's weird about, kind of this idea of sort of migration and the expectation of staying close or going away and stuff like that. I think it was sort of in a way in American history kind of perverted by the focus on emigration from European countries to North America, right? Because we, for example, Oscar Handlin, in the historian in the 50s, who did some good work earlier on in his career, specifically with his wife Mary. But then he wrote a book which I think won maybe a Pulitzer, called Uprooted, I believe. And I hated it because it was so, kind of dismissive in a really racist way of especially Italians, but that's not really that's neither here nor there for this. My point is that his thing was, and it got me focused on it. And I guess, growing up in New England as an Italian American, I always thought, yeah, it's the cutting off, and with, watching movies like The Godfather Part 2, right, where little Vito, is quarantined in the room by himself at Ellis Island as a 11-year-old kid or whatever. I always thought of that was my image of migration, right? Was that, of course, you cut ties, because how could you maintain ties with people back in the old country, right? But then when I started actually, studying American history and reading primary sources of, the Yankees who went from Middletown, Connecticut, where they had first settled, to Ashfield, Massachusetts, to Phelps, New York, to, White Pigeon, Michigan, and other parts, farther west, and stayed in contact with each other, blew my mind. Right, that this was a whole other model, and I realized that I had been kind of blinded by this foreign immigrant experience that had
your peppermint,
dominated my
your peppermint lessons.
Hmm?
Your peppermint lessons reminded me of similar, again, in terms of the fact that even before there was the official royal mail, just how much went around by letter.
Yeah.
And I wasn't thinking of it so much in family terms, but in terms of discussive type correspondence. And it's the fact that you could write off an email, fire it off, get an answer the same day, or even in the same 10-minute from 4 or 5 time zones away. Probably won't get one that fast in 10 times, I think. But seems to have taken away a lot. And we've discussed the Neil Stephenson's Baroque cycle,
right,
a number of times. And you are there at a time where people are sending out 3 or 4 copies of the same letter to go different ways. It's like the internet, because that's what the internet does. It chops your message up into copies and sends it different routes and then reassembles it. That's the thing, And there are, even relative modern day, there was a book. I don't remember what the title is, but there's 2 famous gardeners who are in effectively adjacent counties, albeit separated by the 10th century, who write to each other about what's happening in their garden. They're just 2 old people, they're also both pretty good book authors, and they're medal-winning gardeners and all the rest of it. So they've clearly got something to share, as it were, and compete on. But it's like, let's go look at the other letters that are written, etc., between friends or enemies. What's Newton saying to Leibniz, either in the fictional version or in the real version. And there's a woman who does quite a lot of math type history YouTubes, and she's in the Royal Society old archive library, and she's got the librarian with his cotton-fingered, gloved hand to show her the actual copy of to Leibniz and Leibniz they were discussing the calculus stuff, which was so that physical letter still exists. And there's clearly a non-anxiety item there for Chris that we might find a book in. But that I would think would be significantly intriguing to us. But I've found that book yet, and I've looked for them. But
What was the name of it, Tim?
say again?
What was the name of that book?
No, it wasn't. I said
Oh.
there would be a good
Okay.
margin to find a book that is the whys and wherefores of how individuals that weren't necessarily family had correspondence by letter.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you might well have had touched on that. My example was there's a book by Christopher Lloyd and Beth Chatto. Lloyd is in Great Dixon and Kent, and Beth Chatto is in Elmstead Market, which is in Essex. So they're separated by Thames Estuary. And they were writing these letters in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I think they both died early 2000, the noughties. But the other thing, of course, for me is I've been to both gardens. I've met both people outside the gardens and inside the gardens. And it's all of a sudden, it's like, okay, well, these two people are competitors. They run different plant nurseries. They write different books. They don't always agree. So let's see the conversation. Because that would tell you more about the whys and wherefores of what they're talking about. And or is it something like we need a political biography of somebody who's not really involved in the current day today? So is it, I've mentioned the very British coup as a fictional number 10 politics, often with the right and the US as being one of the other characters, where it's within Thatcher's period that she loses and in comes a lefty Labour person. And one of their manifesto promises is that they will unilaterally disarm nuclear disarmament and in the process have the US remove their bases from the UK. And the book doesn't do it in quite the same way, but the television miniseries with Ray McAnally as the Prime Minister has a line that's something along the lines of, to put it plainly, because the American opposite number decides to throw his toys out of the pram almost. So just to be similarly clear, for our two nations to remain friends, you must remove your bases. And of course, the immediate rhetoric was we're just letting the Russians walk in. And it's like, so the Swedes are letting the Russians walk in, the Swiss are letting the Russians walk in. And West Germans are letting the Russians walk in because at that point there were no atomic weapons in West Germany because that was what the treaty was. And that treaty got changed and broken. So that, given J.D. Vance's commented slagging off of all the Allies, all the losses of the Allies outside ever since Korea, you can see a lot of people want that straight line between the US and Canada to stay, and Greenland to remain in Europe as a whole, in spite of its geography. But I particularly for the next book, as I said in the notes, and as I said in the community chat, Obsidian file. Is there a decent, may not even be a brand new, but is there a decent science book that we want to look at? And one that comes to mind from my side, which I still haven't touched, but I ought to, is the bio of the woman or the process of getting and finding all the details for CRISPR. They have a genetic manipulation for, which I forget the type of, but on the one you can't find a split between religious and cultural. The other piece you might be also semi-referring to is the Alawites, i.e. the people that were Assad's people in Syria, alcohol drinking Muslims. Because that's one of their splits in away from the code breakers is the book I was thinking.
I don't know if I can read Nice's book right now.
So if you find anything that's on the Alawites, as a group, that might be what you might be thinking of, or at least in part.
Well,
They do alcohol, but they don't do pork.
one of the things that strikes me too, in part because Dan mentioned the Thompson article, given what we have been reading, which relies on prior work, which I've seen referenced in multiple books across the space, there are interesting things I'd like to go back and read, either that I missed or I know exist and are often referenced. So within our economics reading, we get lots of references to like Frederick Hayek in his work. So going back and reading something like that, or even on the cultural, sociological stuff, particularly with Graeber, it would be kind of interesting to read, somebody like Marcel Mauss or Claude Lévi-Strauss and some of those kind of seminal, late 1800s, early 1900s works that essentially created the platform for what is the 20th century and how we perceive the world, particularly as a lot of those things. And Wilkerson doesn't spend she probably could have spent a lot more time talking about evolutionary theory in the late 1800s and how that creates this kind of race myth that helped enforce caste. And I feel like she maybe touched on it a tad, but really kind of missed that part of the story, which dramatically accelerated especially the split right after the Civil War going into the 1910s and the 1920s, where all the early anthropology stuff, the anthropologists missed the boat on a bunch of things or went in the wrong direction and created this, horrific scientific myth that, coupled with the racism of caste, accelerated that problem in America, that made it that much harder to overcome because, hey, science says our preconceived notion that this is a thing is actually a thing when in fact it wasn't. I would have loved a chapter on that, but it also makes me want to go back and, read, or maybe something like Max Weber's, Protestant work ethic would be kind of an interesting piece. Some of those older economics or philosophy economics and anthropology that we've seen references to time and time again could be a fun little respite from the super modern, but also to see how do we go from there to get to where we are here.
Yeah. Yeah, I've also been listening to, as I've been walking this week, I was listening a bit to a book called Dissolving Illusions, which was, and the reason I heard this doctor interviewed somewhere, probably Brett Weinstein or somebody, and it was kind of interesting, I thought, and I'm not that I'm buying the entire argument, but she's arguing about the subtitle is Disease, Vaccines, and the Forgotten History, and so it's by Susan Humphreys and she kind of was the kind of come lately to the topic apparently, and this guy Roman Bystrianic or something like that, had been researching it for probably over a decade. And so it's very, very well documented, but it talks about the classical sort of poster child arguments for vaccination, right? Smallpox and then especially polio and sort of kind of complicates them in interesting ways. But along the way, I thought it was interesting that and I'm not recommending that as a read. The reason I brought it up because along the way they go on this kind of tangential, side trip to eugenicism. And again, and so as you're talking about these different, Adam Smith, Stephen Jay Gould, and other people who have sort of put little flags in the ground and have a kind of have a point or have an idea that kind of contributes to this bigger conversation or zeitgeist or whatever it is, that it reminded me that eugenicism is out there, right? And this idea of actually there's a faculty member at UMass who just, I think, died last week, Laura Lovett, and she died kind of young. I think it was a shock to everybody, but she had written a book about pronatalism called Conceiving the Future when she was a Berkeley grad student. And so I think it was her PhD, but it also, sort of adjacent to that was the arts and crafts movement, and eugenicism. So it's kind of weird how these little ideas, that we normally, I mean, my only contact with the arts and crafts movement had been, craftsman furniture and craftsman, bungalow houses in South Minneapolis and things like that. And so
You're Your mention of distaste for Isaacson right now and vaccines reminds me he did have in his biography of Ben Franklin, the original proto-American, like super pro-vaccine, vaccinate. I think he vaccinated himself and his whole family, and
Mhm.
you know, and when you think about it, it's the lack of vaccines at the time that allows almost all of North America to be massively depopulated when,
Well,
Europe invades and
the lack of any type of native resistance or immunity. Well, and also there's that story that came out recently in either a book or an article about inoculation of smallpox and sort of connecting that to germ warfare a little bit.
yeah.
I think it was, God, it was three or 4 years ago. We watched, I think in my little history club that I co-ran up at Bemidji, there was some author was on, did a long form interview on a podcast, and we had the students kind of watch that and
Has
stuff.
your alma mater like come to terms with Amherst's
Jeffrey Amherst, oh yeah, I mean, God,
play in that?
yeah, and Jeffrey Amherst, yeah, and that's the most, the Jeffrey Amherst one, where he actually writes to his subordinates and says, you would do well to take this opportunity, is the most blatant example of that. But there are suggestions that this type of thing was going on, and that not in a germ warfare kind of way, but that a big element of George Washington's success was in that he did inoculate his
Yeah.
and so there's a whole.
Well, it kind of kills me right now that on the far right, the "you will not replace us" people in the anti-vaxxer overlap is leaving themselves open to actually be not replaced, but just totally killed off because they don't want to vaccinate themselves.
Yeah.
This week, I think, or in the last month, I think there now have been almost more cases of, measles in Texas than there were in the entire United States the prior year
Mhm.
before.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and it just like stunning to me. Now, apparently, one of the groups, there was a story of a young couple in their like early 20s that were like, and I thought they were, when I read the headline and had heard stories about it before, I thought they were kind of young modern Americans, but it turns out they were Mennonites
Yeah.
Mhm.
living in Texas who needed a translator to get them into English to understand what was going on and to be interviewed in news stories because their comprehension of English language was, and I didn't say I don't think, but I presume they were speaking German
Sure.
in Texas and we're in a secluded little area, and it's
Mhm.
fairly similar, I think, to the vaccine issues that some of the Hasidic Jews in New York have issues with.
Mhm.
People go travel in or out of the US and they're in New York, and suddenly the Hasidic population is hit heavily because they're not vaccinating and living as this separate subculture within a bigger culture.
Yeah, it's funny that because this thing that I've been listening to about, especially about the early vaccinations, right? And especially live virus, kind of vaccination and stuff. There's so much. Well, they do a great job of citing sources. So I guess if I've only been listening to it so far, but if I pick up the actual print version, I can maybe do some research to sort of validate when they're talking about percentages, whether these percentage changes are statistically significant and reflect a big number, or is it just 100% change from 5 to 10 or that sort of thing, which sometimes happens, and people don't give you the context. But another thing that's happening in the case of these early vaccines, right, is that people are getting just people are having weird kinds of problems with them because they catch something else, right, from these vaccines. They catch like foot and mouth. Foot and mouth is huge, apparently, in these early polio vaccines, and a lot of people get infected. And so, and then more recently, there are other things that have gone in there, and one of them that they're worried about right now, or I don't know if they're worried about it because I can't tell, if it's a percentage thing or an actual numerical problem, is this monkey virus that
Mpox.
yeah, that is apparently giving people cancer. But how many people? Who knows? I don't know.
Mm.
But it's interesting
The
that
virus is a vaccine, or correlated to the vaccine, not correlated to the virus, right?
because the virus that the vaccine is based on is grown in monkeys, right? And so this thing, it's sort of a hitchhiker, this monkey virus that kind of came with, because that's how they develop. The whole process of developing vaccines and getting these getting this pus, this lymph from from cattle that had been infected with the thing. And I mean, the kind of stone tool element of, well, we've got this theory, but the way that we're implementing it is just weird.
Well, you say that too, but it's not really that long ago that humans were living, and probably still a good number do, live with their cattle or livestock in their homes with them.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's,
I mean, I
as
haven't even.
modern Americans, we think that's not a thing, but we don't have to go very far to still see that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I was thinking, at some point soon, haven't got to it yet, but at some point soon in my course, I'm going to have to tell students about the pig clearance of New York City, which doesn't happen until, just before the Civil War, really,
Yeah.
that they go through and they clear the pigs out of people's, garrets and cellars, and stop them from just roaming the streets eating all of the,
Or there were worries that big cities, especially like New York, were just going to be inundated with horseshit
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
because before
Yeah.
the automobile showed up, like we can't get rid of. There's so much manure in the city, we can't get rid of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I had a statistic that I used that the yeah, not the politicians. Well, the book on vaccines, the one that I'm reading, I think, is a little bit on the edge. It's called Dissolving Illusions. I'm not sure that I would recommend that one. I'm not sure that there's another one. There are, I am very interested in, maybe kind of trying to, once again, maybe pull together some of the research that I've done in different areas over the years on kind of the development of American medicine, the development of modern medicine in the US, because I think that hasn't really been, nobody's really done justice to that yet. So maybe I'll take that on someday. But
What's interesting here too is some indigenous cultures have means of transferring memories and knowledge down over generations and they consider it sacrosanct, and it takes a lot of evidence to shift away from those things, or even superstitions. But it's amazing that in a uber literate world, literally within less than 2 or 3 generations of things like polio and the super efficacy of vaccination, that we suddenly have erased this from our memories, and people are actively choosing to go against it.
Right. Well, and the weird thing about polio that I'm just starting to hear in this thing and find out about that I hadn't known, that I'll need to research a little bit more and understand before I can integrate it into what I think I know, is that apparently polio as a virus is endemic. It exists in everybody, and in your intestines, and there's tons and tons of evidence of indigenous people just living with it, right? And that it's not until we get really modernity in the form of really arsenic and DDT that it somehow manages to become. I mean, there is no poliomyelitis, paralysis, kind of thing going on in the native world, or really in any world, before the beginning, the very end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, right? So what changed, right? And there wasn't, as far as diagnosis went, there wasn't a blood test or an antibody test or anything that was the conclusive element of a diagnosis. It was symptomatic, right? And so now people are finding that, and now we have other things that are like transverse myelitis, apparently, which is, we don't call it polio, but symptoms are very similar. And we don't really understand it's sort of, a lot of times it's idiopathic, right? We don't really kind of understand what's going on and what turns this thing from, kind of a chronic or endemic thing to an acute thing. And it may be completely legitimate that it is a problem of modernity, right? That increased cleanliness, right? And increased processing of foods, as Tim says, but also reduced resilience in terms of vitamin C or fresh air or anything like that.
Or even that overlap of everybody moving from small farms in the countryside into big cities, because there is a huge jump. So the transmission rates in a small town or village are fine, which is that one of the big issues that America had with COVID is all the people who live in the middle who don't see and interact with or go to places where they're are thousands of people every day, it's
Mhm.
COVID transmission in a small town is dramatically different than it is in big top 10 media market cities like New York, LA,
Sure.
Houston, where it's a bigger deal, and you're going to be in a single day as an individual, you're going to be exposed to 100 times more people than the average person living out in Peoria.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
there is that as an issue, but you're also going to be more impacted if you do live in Peoria and you only have one hospital and no other options
Right.
for
Right.
treatment. If there is an outbreak in your city, more people are going to die.
Right.
And I think she discusses in here, I think it was in here in the tail end, a huge number, America per capita lost way more people than any other industrialized country,
Right.
which she lays in part at the feet of the caste issue, which I'm sure she is right in some respects, although there are other confounding things going on, I think, in the public health
Right.
area that we deal with culturally.
Well, and then that little telomere, I mean, it's only like 2 or 3 pages long, right? That moment too. Sort of like, well, okay, what is it that that creates the stresses that produce these types of outcomes? Right? And so I do think that's interesting too, right? The idea of pre-existing conditions, comorbidities, as is the current sort of favorite term ever since COVID, right? That there are all kinds of ways that we're maybe more at risk and more susceptible than than other people in different places or at different times might have been.
The other obvious clear outcome of what the changes is the obesity and the diabetes.
Right. Yeah.
And at some point, we've now also got that thing that people are dying of cancer. Whereas that seemed not to be a diagnosis from before because of the lack of understanding. Nor there was sufficient number of people dying of other causes before that happened.
Mhm.
And that's that whole
Well, or just not living long enough for something to become a problem.
yeah. But it's why do you die? Is it just sheer harshness of the old style life, of a non-modernity life? Yeah, even with things like pre-health and safety type stuff and all the rest of it, you're on that, since we mentioned it, you're on that factory-sized spinning wheel, and you're going to go deaf, and you're likely to have an industrial accident because it's a dangerous open-wheeled machine that's not really human scale. It's not really human powered. It's now steam powered or electric powered, and it's going to crush you like a T-34 tank because that's what it does.
Yeah, or rip your arm off or whatever.
And from elements of my perspective, I see that coming back in the reports of things like Amazon and Tesla working conditions and things like, oh, the rocket blew up. When can we put another one up? And it's like, we don't know why the other one blew up yet. Why don't we wait a bit? Oh, no, progress. So there's elements. So there's elements of I want to get the next one up because the next one's already got some refinements in, etc. So, but the polio one is a good one, I think, in the sense of rather like I think it's Pat said he's got somebody in his stuff. I got somebody in mine who had a slight polio condition, so he had baggy legs, so he had braces to try and straighten them a bit. And I think he was also slightly asymmetric in the length. And he's still around. And yet he would have been within the generation that had in the UK a sugar cube when you are whatever, 6 months or 18 months old. Yeah, and then of course you get, as somebody pointed out, a rapid unscheduled disassembly. It's just the normal bullshit for saying that's your position. You'd like to stand there and catch the whole wheat sheaf. Oh shit, we forgot to take the pitchfork out of it before we threw it. Type approach to health and safety. But
Yeah.
And yet, I would like, it's the sort of things that you figure out at the age we are now that you never think of as a kid to say, granddad, or even better still, great granddad, what did people in your village die of?
Mhm.
You know, the one thing I do know of, not my granddad, but my great uncle, who I never met because he died of dust. He was a coal miner. So by then, we were a national coal company. So it was government run. But they were still pushing back on health and safety to an extent. All that stop stuff, things like, no, you don't need to take a candle down to light your way. You can take a no. I mean, it's like take a canary too, not sort of thing. And by that time, the Welsh mines were really deep. You were several minutes in the lift going down.
Mhm.
Get there. So it's not like you could just, oh yeah, you're going to run away from the damn fire. You're going to have to hide somewhere in a reverse cut back side branch or something and hope for this. And otherwise, we'll come and get you in a couple of weeks' time just to make sure we've got the sibling relationship meant that my grandfather didn't go down the mines. He was the engineer at top running the boilers to get the steam to push them up and down, ventilate, pump all the water out, and provide compressed air for the tools because they're just more intrinsically safe. So by the time we get to 1930s, I suppose, we've got a much safer mine, but we're digging deeper, we're digging further, we're digging longer. And then World War II comes along, what Bevy boys take over because they want all the miners to go to war. So they send all the 15, 16, and 17-year-olds down to become a significant lump of workforce by the book. We didn't send the youngsters to war, we just sent them down a company. Or if you got really lucky, you got put up a land farm, along with most of the girls to do the agriculture job.
I wonder if I can. I've got an image.
So,
Figure out how to show it.
I'm sort of suddenly waiting for the flip because we've been an hour now. We haven't really done the book. And I thought the first chapter 25, 26, 27
Yeah.
were really quite good because I lived those in the sense of I was actually watching the process. Obama's year, although not so much his election, but Trump's first and second. And I thought there was this, I can't remember what her name was now, but there was a woman who was quoted a couple of times. And apparently she's done a lot of work into the white voting pattern. And her name will come back to me, no doubt, Ashley Jardina. And I'm going, okay, the Wikipedia page for her and the book doesn't give her a picture, but she's a blonde white woman, which I didn't pick up from the name one way or the other, as opposed to, sort of Granny Smith.
Right.
Yet, a guy I know called Ian Dixon. Ian Dixon is as black as the Ace of Spades and out of Baltimore, one of the places that we talked about being racist. You see that contemporary wise, or at least contemporary to me in that sense, through things like way the class works, drug culture works, and the way the schools operate, etc., etc. In spite of the bus, that may or may not be happening. Because if I remember rightly, the Polish guy that leaves the police force becomes a teacher, seems to always be teaching 100% black guy. And he's also one of the few white people in the school. And, most of the teachers are black. So it would be. So is he a DEI appointment as a stupid white person or a white person that's not really a teacher? Then okay, you can have a black school. And he's Polish, so it's not clear how many generations. His uncle is senior policeman, so is at least the second generation, if not
Right.
third, fourth.
Right.
And
Yeah,
it's like,
I
on
don't
that
think.
basis, why are we getting the stuff he's talking about, particularly in part 6, backlash,
Yeah.
when clearly, from my perspective, Trump's not even a wasp.
I think that changes over time, though, right? I mean, one of the things that
But
interesting
he's
about
not
it,
Protestant, not Anglo-Saxon.
right, is that you've got, yeah, so he's, from the perspective of, of the Cabots who speak only to the lodges, and the lodges who speak only to God. Yes, he's not a member of that inner circle. But I mean, but one of the things, when we get to this, like chapter 29, right, when she starts giving these, and pardon me, but I'm looking above, I've got a screen that and I'm looking at the text up there, and when we start to talk about these rates of change, right, that we're getting, that our public health system is falling apart, and we've got the highest incarceration rate in the world, and we've got the, and our life expectancies are going down, and but all of these things are sort of measurements of a divergence of results at the top from results at the bottom, and and again, sort of playing with statistics, right? One of the biggest, and she does mention infant mortality, right? One of the biggest changes in all of these measurements over time, right? Throughout all of this history that we've been talking about in across many different books, right? Is the change in infant, generally lifespan, sort of national lifespan measurements really reflect to an inordinate degree changes in infant mortality, right? So if you get past the first 5 years, then, then you're in pretty good shape oftentimes. And if you don't, if a large number or a large percentage of children don't, then your national life expectancy number is going to be really, really adjusted downward for that, for only that. It's not like, people who survive childhood are dying in prisons or mines or dangerous jobs or of deaths of despair at, really statistically significant rates, unfortunately, because I do think that those things are all true and are all happening, but I don't think that the numbers, unfortunately, manage to get granular enough and specific enough to kind of do justice to that type of an analysis. But I do think that there's something going on with these, with this divergence of the, of the elite from the subalterns, right? Who are, for whom, go all the way. I mean, we've talked about it across many books, white trash, and all these things that and this I think explains to a great extent, and the frustration over this, and the frustration over nothing being done to address this in a team that called itself liberal, explains a lot of the appeal of the Trump movement, the MAGA movement.
So in that basis, then, why do you want to cancel one, those people tracking the numbers because you want the problem to go away, and two, why are you cancelling all the health insurance? Obama medical aid and so forth, just because of a name. And so you're going to kill everybody that way.
Well,
Obamacare.
The Obamacare, the ACA is very flawed, right? It's not a single payer program, right? In some ways it's a giveaway, it's a huge profit opportunity for the existing insurance companies and health maintenance infrastructure, right? It's a huge boon to them. But yes, I agree, Pat. I think we should do plutocrats next. I think everybody's
turn it around the other way. And one of the statistics that I always see quoted for it was it's put another X million under insurance cover. So if you're not already paying for your insurance in some way because you can't afford it, it's a market that they're not collecting anyway. But now they might, because they might want to buy some adults. But in terms of Obamacare, generally, not necessarily specifically, or not necessarily specifically with that one, but in terms of his 2 seasons, he needed to get past the likes of Mitch McConnell. And day one, the opposition statement is he needs to be a single-term president, which is, even I knew that as a quote before I read it for this cycle. And it's like, if you are then going to obfuscate any progress by POTUS, then there is zero blame, inverted commas, for him. But overall, it was still like a deficit reduction two-term. At least everything I see quoted back is that, Carter didn't do much, but did not bad. And then Clinton did pretty well, Obama did pretty well, and the numbers aren't really out fully probably on Biden because it hasn't gone through the complete cycle yet. So, you kept on tripping him up, and then you complained he didn't complete the race. So,
Yeah, I mean, so the whole system is a shit show, basically, is what we can conclude from all that. But
so the other thing I'm seeing external to the reading are people, some instances of people on the right saying, so how else would you crash the system sufficiently to change it, except by putting an idiot like Trump there, such that you can get those changes through, come what may. And it's not a caste thing. It's we want to change the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that it's hard. It's very difficult at this point to peel away all of the rhetoric and all of the assumptions and all of the just it's not clear to me that, for example, with as simple and kind of obvious an issue as tariffs, right? There are a lot of assumptions about what the right economic answer to that is, and a lot of times they draw on historical arguments, right, and historical perspectives, but the historical period that that often they're talking about, and I think the Republicans are talking quite a bit about this, this golden age that they believe in, that lasted somehow from the beginning of the Republic through the era of good feelings and into the kind of the period up until and just before, in some cases, Andrew Jackson, right? It was a period of economic growth, but it wasn't sort of apples to apples. It wasn't, America then wasn't like America now. America in the world, America's role in the world wasn't like our role in the world now. Other people going from arguing the other perspective will say, well, wait a minute, what about the post-war period, right? What about this period after the Second World War when we rebuilt Europe and we rebuilt Asia by way of, Japan and Korea and Taiwan. And we were, I mean, obviously the free trade or tariff decision at that point is a different one as well, because there isn't a legitimate competitor, right? We are certainly the economic superpower in that half century, right? So there, or at least the first quarter of that half century after the Second World War, or the first quarter century of that half century, the first half of it. And so I don't think that it's easy to draw, and I think that that's the problem, is people are getting kind of sucked down into these arguments by analogy that are not valid on either side.
Well, some of it too, and I spent some time this week thinking about with respect to tariffs and its effect. So, in the span of 2 days, over $6 trillion of value was wiped off a lot of balance sheets, which is phenomenally crazy. But it's also, you can frame it as a tax on everybody in America, whether you're rich or poor. And what I'm presuming part of his goal is to get production to come back to America to kind of level things back off. Because one of the things that has happened roughly since, that post-war shift, when all these other countries that we rebuilt, we helped rebuild Germany. Although, to be honest, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians rebuilt themselves using different models and different ideas. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think a huge amount of what rebuilt Japan was they were already a well-educated society, and they brought in manufacturing.
Sure.
And they used the ideas of W. Edwards Deming and J.M. Durand and did it way better than even America was doing, to slingshot themselves way past American
Oh,
manufacturing.
right. And also industrial policy,
Yeah.
right? Which they had a more compliant
Well,
population and business community to do, right? And and the $2 billion on the most favored, trading
Yeah.
nation status that we gave them.
Well, they also were more likely to use new ideas and new manufacturing methods that Americans, because we'd already invested in a way of doing things, were
Right. And
not
ours hadn't
going
been bonded to
not going
do
to
it.
we're
Right.
not going to change.
Right.
So even, and I had been doing research in, typewriter history. The heyday of American typewriter manufacture goes into the early 50s, maybe to the late 50s, but by 58-ish, a lot of American companies are either selling off or aggregating, but Germany and Italy are jumping way ahead in terms of engineering practice and
Mm,
making better, cheaper typewriters. So all the American brands, the Royals and the Smith Coronas suddenly, and Remingtons, are being sidelined. And
mhm,
then after that, Japan becomes even better and cheaper at doing bulk stuff. So it all moves to Japan,
mhm,
and that's as it's that as an industry is dying. And now the only place on the planet, India closed manufacture in 2011, I think 2013, somewhere in there. And China still makes them in huge amounts. I don't know who's really buying them. It's certainly not an American audience, but they're cheap, total cheap pieces of crap.
mm,
So you can watch that manufacturing thing both in terms of quality and quantity and that's a great space to watch that. But you can also mirror that with computer technology in the last 30 or 40, 50 years. Who's doing it? Where is it being manufactured and where is it cheap? But
mhm.
the other thing that strikes me about the tariffs as versus our reading of Donut Economics is these tariffs are going to destroy growth as we've known it in the last 50 years. And so is this the thing that brings us to, Kate Rayworth's soft landing, possibly, although it's going to be a tumultuous, bumpy, turbulent landing at best. And can what that landing looks like be continued in whatever the next two administrations are? Because it's going to need more than 4 years. It's not going to, most car manufacturers right now in North America have built infrastructure across the border into Mexico. The things are crossing the border 5 and 6 times before they're being assembled into cars.
Right.
And it's going to take way more than 4 years of one president's administration to change those manufacturing pathways and routes and infrastructure
Mhm.
to be one thing or another to kind of even out where are things made and what does the global trade space look like.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and also I think that we need to, really stay focused on whether these changes are really happening. I mean, there's been so much hoopla that's come out of announcements, right? That, TSMC is going to, spend $100 billion in the US. That's easy to say, right? If they do it, that will be interesting and valuable. But how long is it going to take them to do it and all that? I do think that because I was involved in sort of high tech during that era, that whole idea of, I mean, I used to sort of follow high tech when I was in it, and in my whole, kind of portfolio, that was like my thing. Was I didn't just sort of generally invest, but I kind of, you know, traded tech stocks, and and there were plenty of companies, right? Cypress and and all these little people who were making chips, right? And then, so that would be interesting, to kind of dig into a little bit, what I think it was an unforced error. I think it was, but I think it was, it was people with really, really big, with a lot of money and huge egos at the time, like as Silicon Graphics, owning MIPS and just saying, well, we're just gonna
Yeah.
farm that out.
Well, it's one of those things when you think about American growth versus Chinese growth, at least typically it's framed that the Chinese are thinking in spans of 100 to 500 years of where are we going to be 100 years from now or 400 years from now, whereas America is like, we only care about the next quarter.
It's quarterly.
And and that time frame is shrinking just the same way roughly our attention spans are shrinking from reading a novel to watching a movie to reading a tweet
Right.
or watching a 6 second reel. Like how, our attention spans are going shorter and shorter, and the American economy has been doing that same thing to the point that everybody is worried this week that the economy can go on its head inside of 2 days, and and what happens, and our attention span is that short rather than for the
Well,
economic.
and how much attention and how much emphasis and importance are we giving to this? I mean, you yourself a couple minutes ago said, $6 billion in value has been taken off the board. Is that is that relevant, important? Is it actually going to stick for the long term, or is this going to be absorbed? One of the things that I've heard said about, and somebody should back this up with numbers too if they're going to make this claim, but I've heard said about the tariff is that, a 10% tariff, somebody did a little spiel and said, well, X amount of it gets absorbed by the country on whom it's being placed. X amount gets absorbed by the companies, X, and then their ultimate claim was that only about 2% of that got, actually ended up in prices. And, and I would have liked to have seen, the citation and the data, the data sets on which they base that claim, because if that was actually the case, then that would be relevant in our discussion of whether it makes sense to, to do some of these things. I do think that this short-term focus is problematic, right? Because I'm still not clear, and I don't think anybody is really, if they're honest in the media, of whether these things are primarily being done in the moment as a bargaining chip for Trump to use, as a stick for him to use in a negotiation, or to raise revenue and to say, oh, we're going to move back to some type of putative historical, we'll raise revenue by way of tariffs and not by way of income taxes, 19th century model, or this reciprocity and trade balance and kind of diplomacy and the
Well,
US
the original,
in the
But
economics.
I think it depends on his whim at the moment, right? His son's statement yesterday was clearly the first of those three. If you get last in line for the negotiation, you lose. If you get first in line for the negotiation, you win.
Yeah.
But win what? And that's the problem is
Win,
he
yeah,
has,
right,
he has
sure,
other
yeah,
than,
of course, right,
well,
no, you win
which is
with
why
this
you use
era.
the word whim,
Your
I
prize,
guess. But
your prize is the beating stops for a few weeks.
Right. And my guess is that it's all of the above. It's all three of them in different circumstances, with different trade partners or whatever. But that's exactly the stuff that ought to be communicated, right?
well, the bigger problem though, and she doesn't say it directly in this, is, but she uses examples of like brain drain. She doesn't say brain drain from Germany during the war, but a huge number of Germans and Hungarians moved from Europe to America and really catapulted us into a technological age that should have belonged to another country because they were driven out.
well, some of those.
But we also, she does make the specific argument that by pushing all these people down and marginalizing them, we create our own brain drain from the bottom, that we're not educating people and helping them be the best they can, which really should be framed in modern America as a national security issue. If China can do better for their people across the board, even if they hurt or marginalize people like the Uyghurs, which may or may not help them, they're still helping a much larger proportion of their people be educated and do better things, that then gives them a massive, and because they have the manufacturing that America is lacking, if they suddenly decide, okay, we can afford not to send chips, or we've built in things to disable all of your chips, we can turn America off overnight and then dominate and invade. And we've got a much larger population than you do now. The only thing we've got is a nuclear response as a means of deterrent, which they may or may not care about, or that, somebody like Putin may or may not care about. So how do you leverage what you've got? And if you took nuclear weapons off the table right now, China totally would dominate.
Oh, yeah.
On every facet, but economically, number of people wise and technology wise, America has lots of ideas, but we don't have the ability to manufacture and put them into place right now the way we did in a pre-World War II fashion, where we can turn on a dime and just go. We don't have that capability, and that's a huge problem that Trump and nobody is working at. But if we had we were putting money into education as a means of national defense, boy, we would be doing way better.
Yeah.
To do that and bring back some or even out the manufacturing imbalance.
Right. Well, and Pat's got a point. They've got 34,000 miles of high-speed rail or something, and we've got the the billions of dollars that California spent to build nothing, basically. So,
Well, one of the things I was trying to push in on when you particularly focused on tariffs, when the tariff discussion this season started, it was only between Canada and Mexico, if I remember rightly. It ping-ponged backwards and forwards several times, went away completely. I mean, it's come back with this, Freedom Day or whatever it is. Liberation Day, sorry.
Liberation
Day.
Freedom.
Yeah. And all of this, and all of this discussion about the rates of the various metrics that you use to decide where you are in the league.
Mm-hmm.
I know within this audience, all I've got to do is look to my left and say, enough. And the numbers clearly changed, but the overall effect hasn't. And then in terms of it's a negotiating chip, okay, well, Canada-wise, you're now negotiating directly with a world-class bank. I think Trump particularly will lose that one. Along the lines of he will also lose the fact that this is an unnatural straight line on a map. Has he not looked at a US fucking state map before? How many of those straight lines are there? And like somebody recently was talking about the panhandle of Oklahoma that goes over the top of Texas.
Yeah.
As being, it's there for political reasons, not for any real geographical reason. And one of the things that comes up, particularly in the ecotopia type dystopias stories, is we would like to change the boundaries and make them much more sensible for ecological reasons. So then you go by watershed. And where is my watershed? So that makes Mississippi
climate or
the
something.
biggest place going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, but the thing that we all use and the thing that the climate functions on is moving water about, amongst other things.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that can give you a defined area. That if the thing that one of the things that comes up when you look at the Hungarian economist likes to override with the libertarian type thing, Austrian school, is you can't stop me doing my business just because I'm polluting somewhere. Well, polluting might actually get out of jail card free thing, because back when Rylands v. Fletcher, there was no real pollution context. But Rylands v. Fletcher is common law status saying you cannot put anything on your land that you then for whatever reason, accidentally or deliberately, allow to escape that then affects my land. And the original case was somebody built a dam to make a lake. And then the lake decided to escape. It flooded me downhill. And it's like, natural event. Oh, no, sorry. You contained the water, and it was the containment, not the rainfall or anything else. It was you held back, whatever, 20 million gallons or whatever, that wouldn't otherwise be there. So, and the other common original use was you've got to maintain your fences and hedges, because that's what keeps good neighbours, so your cattle don't suddenly wander over my lawn and eat the grass and poop all over my lawn, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't bothered to think about that much since university days when we were doing law, albeit 1 hour a week with the engineering stuff. But why and how was pollution, that we now understand it as, was exempt? Because nobody thought the atmosphere was a boundary. And you can't put a boundary up. You just have to make your emissions cleaner. And that's expensive, difficult, not possible back when the law was being looked at eventually. So, and I suppose in some respects, the more famous ecological type fiction book is Ecotopia by Calabat. And you've got at least North California, Oregon, and some of Washington seed for US. But it's also their primary issue is we've got the control of the watershed. So I presume there must be some sort of South Cal River that goes further out into like Utah or Nevada. But that the element of what would you do, given that clearly, that, I mean, I see with a lot of political type comment about, oh, this nice experiment to make a republic, a modern republic of equals in law, etc., has clearly failed. So what are you going to do next? Not what are you going to change, tweak, and move slightly, but what are you actually going to do next? Clearly, there is some form of revolution going to happen in some form or other, bloody or not. But politically, what you have, what you think you had 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, which books we've read clearly say you didn't really have, because corporates dominated too much, they're controlling the price of light bulbs. And how do you do that? By also controlling the performance, so nobody can do a 10,000 plus light bulb, except in East Germany, because they won't pass with your free market.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but I mean, there's an assumption of kind of inevitability in there as well, and I tried to deal with that a little bit in and again also with the I mean, I think that the issues of commons and common and common resources, especially natural resources, and the development of corporations and corporate structure and limited liability, and all of that, kind of comes together in the story of the textile industry, right, in New England in the 1830s and 1840s, right, which sort of culminated this. I mean, it goes from this, you were talking about the flowing water, right? I mean, there was an English common law idea that was represented by a Latin phrase, aqua corret et debet correre, as it was, so water flows and should flow as it has always flowed, right? So that the legal principle was that if you did something like dammed a stream and caused damages, then you were liable to the people who had equal access to that
water power,
and that gets subverted. That gets subverted over time in New England, to the extent where, by the time of, before the Civil War, really, but the late 1840s, early 1850s, the Boston Manufacturing Company owns really the Merrimack River from its source in Lake Winnipesaukee to the ocean and controls it entirely, right? And there's a class action suit at one point against the Boston Manufacturing Company and the PLC, which is the proprietors of the Locks and Canals, which is a subsidiary of theirs, that where the local people in the Lowell area, which was an entirely created city, that they were suing for the not only for the pollution of the river and the loss of the fresh water, but also for the loss of the fisheries, right? Because the fish had not only been poisoned, but they had prevented all the migratory species, the shad and the Atlantic salmon, and all those other species had been prevented from reaching their spawning grounds, and so they were gone. And so there was a settlement of ultimately about $24,000 or $26,000 that this class action suit got settled, which meant that this large group of people all got a little bit of money, $50 each or whatever it probably worked out to. And what they did was they signed away their posterity's rights to make any claims, right? Because that's the way a settlement works. Right, so they basically sold their rights, and so that's one of the outcomes of this whole process of industrialization, right? But the other, and so when I talk to students about that, it's kind of depressing, right? But then I get to the end of it, and it's sort of like, well, but was it inevitable, right? Because who was the guy that Nathan Appleton and Francis Cabot Lowell were emulating when they went to New Lanark? Well, it was Robert Owen. Well, what's Robert Owen's story, right? He bought the mill from his father-in-law, David Dale, and then he ran it at New Lanark, and it was the biggest water-powered operation and the most profitable textile operation in Great Britain. And it continued until 1968. They kept running it on the water power of the Clyde River until 68 when it became a museum. And so, but what did he do with his, he had equivalent power to Appleton and Lowell. I mean, he created a whole community at New Lanark for the workers, although it's apparently in the middle of nowhere. I haven't been there, but he had the same type of power to kind of manipulate society, and he chose a different path.
Yeah. So if you take that same example and you analogize it with the the rights to the digital river of information almost every American has given up to big social media and people like Mark Zuckerberg, who also now has the ability to create, mass shifts in American culture just with small, tiny tweaks that you may not notice right away, or that take a long time longer because now AI is like tweaking the algorithm and it's not necessarily Mark or people in the company actively doing that. Easily it could have shifted an election, any of the last three election cycles. He could have put just enough nudges with they could have taken smart guesses early on, and they did and gathered data to show that, yes, we probably could do this. And there's proof that they could have. But that same giving
Well,
up
Cambridge Analytica.
your rights to, your streams, the streams have changed in how they're doing it, but the people you're giving over those rivers to have power over you now.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, the sense that the idea that, well, this was inevitable in order for technology to, to move forward, it had to do this thing, right? That's the story that Jaron Lanier tells in Who Owns the Future about Ted Nelson and all that, right? So yeah. So we add, we've got these little, we've got a whole bunch of these little elements that kind of add to this story about how did we get to this moment. And I think we've identified kind of a bunch of them.
Well, I mean, the other one that came up, somebody was talking about some other adult and his critique of economics and processes and all this. Some guy called Dan, on his Substack.
What did I say?
A.A. Brell did the critique.
Oh, Adolf Berle. Yeah. So yeah, Adolf Berle. Well,
and you got me really confused because who you're really talking about is Adolf Berle Jr., not Adolf Berle.
Adolf Berle. Yeah, it was Adolf Berle Jr. You're right. Yes, Adolf Augustus Berle Jr. specifically. Yeah, and Eleanor Ostrom. Right? Is that an article, or did she write a full book about that? Can we get her?
I just dipped
out of the article or out of the Nobel speech or something.
I just dipped a bit and found the book, but I haven't looked at it further.
Okay. Yeah. I think there are a lot of these. I think there are a whole kind of there's a sort of a constellation of these ideas that might be part of if only by analogy, again, might be part of a kind of a tool set of how to think about the stuff that we're dealing with. That might be an interesting project to kind of put that together. I do think that for next week we won't be meeting because I'll be traveling up to see the kids at Bemidji. But the following week, if we start with Plutocrats, I think Plutocrats will be a fast read, and I think I'll be interested in, because it is about 10 years old. I'll be interested in kind of seeing what's changed and what we might, what might be challenged by subsequent events, or what might just have kind of continued, and what the following 10 years after she wrote might have doubled down on. Now she was, as I recall, and I may be leaning too much into this, but as I recall, she was very kind of, she was naming names and stuff, but she was also kind of a wannabe, right? She was trying to kind of elbow her way into the little crowd at the cocktail party and become part of the conversation. And of course, she was successful ultimately in doing that, right? And she became a member of the Canadian government. So that'll be relevant possibly to the story as well. Yeah. Then beyond that, I think there's a lot of ways that we can go. But I do like this kind of project of sort of identifying, kind of ideas and that can be tools. Some good links in here. I'm fascinated by. I haven't popped open these China videos, Patrick, but I will be interested in seeing what that's all about.
Yeah, particularly that playlist by what looks like an American in that perspective.
Yeah, he's a really interesting guy who speaks multiple languages and interacts with the native populations of wherever he's touring.
Interesting. I was looking at, who was it earlier today? What's the guy's name that you're talking about, Pat?
He calls himself Sabbatical. I'm not sure what his real name is.
Okay.
But he lived in Shanghai for like 5 years, so he speaks Chinese fluently.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of there are a lot of people who want to share ideas about China right now, I guess. Yeah, the the inevitability of China as well kind of interests me, right? The kind of the, kind of the, the historical, I mean, going back to the very beginning, 2 hours ago, we began with Tim's reposting his photo of Zheng Hei's ship compared to the Pinto or the Santa Maria or whatever it was that's in front of it in the mall. That's the thing that always. I actually had someone from China, an educator from China, get in touch with me on Substack, and she sent me two Chinese world history textbooks in Chinese with PDFs of them, and I haven't had a chance to really dig in yet. Hopefully this summer I'll be able to make a little project of that. The problem is I haven't been able to figure out how to translate them in blocks. There were some file size issues, and so I made the file sizes smaller. I tried to do it by chapter by chapter, and even then it kind of crapped out on me. So all of the things that even paid ones that were giving me kind of a free look didn't really seem to do a great job of it in more than sort of one block of text at a time. So I may have to, if I really want to understand what they're saying, I may have to actually go in and page at a time, text block at a time, kind of.
Well, if you look at the Substack link that I sent for this for Zubrin or Zubrin's book list, he has a number of Chinese author books. I mean, probably not much one of the Japanese one. There's certainly been some Chinese ones.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly Persian, Iranian, and there's the odd one from the Stanzi. And then there's some European looking the other way. But the bulk of them, as I say, are sort of Middle East, North Africa origin. But India comes up quite a lot too. So, and as I say, it's been going a while, but he's literally this week started to shift the old book summary and cover picture. I don't think he's necessarily shifted any of the discussions that they have encouraged. And there's well over 1,000+ people on the Facebook page. And by far the
Facebook
majority of them. Sorry?
Did you say Facebook or Substack?
He's literally he's moving this, or he's copying the original post from Facebook to Substack.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I don't know whether he's including any of the conversations. And some books get 10 people saying things that are more useful than, oh, that looks like a good one to add to my to be read list.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the people on his Facebook group, well, it's a page of that. I don't think it's a true group. Same name, though, for them, are giving feedback. And there are instances where there is authors of that book or authors of the book that tells the counter story piping up to add bulk.
Oh, that's cool.
Counter debate. Yes. And so he's now trying to do one book as a podcast with either an academic on the subject or the author to add to the Substack. And then, as I say, there's typically a theme for the month. At the moment, it's the boundary, what went across the boundary between Europe and Islam and why Europe got so big. But there's a well over 1,000 books on the list. And I can't think of any of them that are not available in English translation.
Cool.
There might be, because I might have missed one. And some of them are translated. Others, because they're academic, are written by whoever, but in English. So I would, you could easily lose yourself for a week in terms of a sort of pictorial library chat, just to come up with a short list of what about these 3 books. As I say, this March, April, or certainly March, might be as far as you need to go because of the Europe stroke Islam boundary, what crossed over the line, where and when that. And many of them are items that you probably wouldn't see in a little village, certainly wouldn't see in a village bookshop. But you'd have to go to a big city, dangerous place bookshop. Dangerous because you've got a bigger range of books, including those in the free world. You always have To Kill a Mockingbird, unlike some places, which I noticed is back on the banned list. But, as I say, he seems to be a nice, approachable bloke. I don't know where he's from originally, but he's a Muslim Arab type name that somewhere in the States, as I say, was working for US aid, NGO type stuff. And so he's out of work. Yeah, well,
Yeah. All right. Let's see. What else is going on? There's a lot in chat today, and I will be going through the chat this afternoon. Yeah. Okay. We have any last words on Caste?
Glad we read it. I'm
Okay.
gonna have to go back through that part 3 with the 8 pillars, and there's a few other pieces I'm gonna reread
Yeah.
to pull some better stuff out of.
Mhm.
I think that her point that America is voting against its interests specifically to keep caste in place is probably one of the most useful things I pulled out of, or one of the pieces that are hiding from how most of the left looks at America and wonders why the hell is the right doing what they're doing.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's really the thing that's scary. And it's probably scaring even a lot of people on the left, or at least 1.5% of them who are willing to say, hey, let's vote for the clown in chief.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not like there hasn't been that whole, clinging to their Bibles and guns, kind of sentiment going on the
Yeah.
left side, so it's not something that they've been unaware of, but yeah.
And the other thing too, and I've been trying to think of other examples besides America, India, and Nazi Germany, and it's probably much more subtle and harder to pull out, but some of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, I think, is tied up in the various classes of people. And early on, when you see the shift from the Republic to the Empire, the powerful people at the top who were both economically and from a class perspective in power because of how things were structured, were able to hold on to it and kind of the melting pot of the rest of, I think the Romans did an awful lot better at building empire and subsuming cultural ideas, or allowing cultural ideas to come into play.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Then even America is doing. America just thinks, oh no, we're better but fall in love with our culture.
Right.
But we're also on that place where we go from empire or from republic potentially into empire because of, cultural pieces of what are at play.
Or just by way of becoming an empire and going out and conquering territories like Greenland and
Canada and Mexico.
But really, do you think, Chris, that is that really Rome, or is that given?
Well, and there's that too, but
that would be an interesting sort of commentary on on Gibbon and his time too.
Well, but even without Gibbon in the fall part, it's even that earlier shift from republic to empire.
Right, but he's narrating kind of the status quo ante as well. So
yeah, but
understanding of that.
you were saying about it, there was clean process and all this. All of those major changes, not just the fall of Caesar, the uprise of the next triumvirate that did it in the meanwhile before Octavian properly became Augustus. You had, even within less than a generation, you had Gaius Julius was at risk as a young man from Sulla, who took over from Marius, if I remember rightly. And the mechanism was not a peaceful transfer of power, because you put the proscribed list up, and if you were Cicero, for instance, as in Rachel Meadow this time around, you had your tongue and your hands cut off, and then they got stapled to the Senate door. So it was a violent change of process, the same as it was as and when you had a change of dynasty in most of the monarchies. The House of York and the House of Lancaster didn't get on. The Dauphin of France decided he wanted all of France, we now think it's France, in spite of the fact most of it being British, as it were. Hence the 100 Years' War. All you've got is a scale of of the speed of response almost. And in that context, if things like there is sufficient pushback against the tariffs and then sufficient pushback internally in the US, an easy, very fast way is, as we almost spoke of a moment ago, is okay, we know who you know because we've got your Gmail address book and your contact list off of Facebook, etc., etc., etc. And it's like we suck all that out, match it up with all the social security numbers we now got and all your medical files we've now already got, and join it all up with your tax information that says he's got 6 houses. Let's go check them all because he's going to hide in one, at least initially. And providing he doesn't know we're coming, and it's like you see, there's clearly been a number of videos, particularly for students getting their student type or their doctoral type visas revoked, but they're not being told. You're just being picked off the street and then being told if you're lucky. And there was that British woman who got walked across the Canadian border for a long reason. It's like 3 weeks before she got surfaced out, as in, sorry, if you'd have told us that you would have paid for your own ticket to leave the US, we'd have let you go straight away. And it's like, I did tell you repeatedly that everybody on your side of the administration of this jail said, we can't talk to you. And then you get a 3-page write-up in The Guardian saying, no, this is a blonde white woman, Brit passport, that whatever failed across the border. I can understand what was the really other nice one was other Brits, again, 2-3 weeks incarceration to sort it out. She's on a tourist visa, but the process she's using, rather like Airbnb, is cheaper because you trade some of the cost of your Airbnb type stuff as housework. So you're not on a tourist visa, except the company that organises it, in theory, clearly knows you can't come on a tourist visa. You've got to come on a work visa because you are working for your accommodation. You know? Now, whether that was an overzealous use in
That does seem like it's a bit much.
And why did she get picked? And it's a white Brit. You know, it's not as though it's clearly a rapist out white Brit woman. It's clearly not a rapist out of the prison in Guatemala, wherever.
So if you're a blogger, cum journalist, your vacation that you use to write and make money on your blog, suddenly you're going to be on social media if you're making a penny while you're traveling.
And it's like, while I'm doing a 6-month tour of the US, I happen to sell a few things on Caste or eBay. Oh shit, income is taxable. You know, therefore it's work, right? You know? And on that basis, I keep doing workouts in the gym even when I tour. Is that work? Physics wise, mathematically wise, it's just not monetary. Maybe I'm paying for it. I'm not getting anything back. I'm not getting any money back.
Ultimately, it's all entropy.
Yeah,
but we're out of time.
What's
Thank you, Ms. Wilkerson.
Yeah. I agree with your conclusion thing in that context of it's the why you seem to associate your power with your colour so much that you now don't have any coloured people in your cabinet, unlike you did last time. So in the third term, there'll be no women, right? Because we'll be well on to Handmaid's Tale.
The third term.
Yeah.
If there is a third term, then we'll be more likely to be on the way to that. I'll grant you that.
I'm hoping for lots of backlash in the midterms.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm hoping for actually not so much that it prevents any good that might come out of all of these changes, from actually coming. Because I think that, as we were talking about an hour ago, I think that the tragedy of all these things always is that somebody tries something, and as you were saying earlier about Mitch McConnell and Obamacare, it never has a chance even to be tested for
But
whether or not it's going to work the way it was intended.
but like the ACA, Dan, this is only a part of what would actually be necessary to achieve the stated goals.
Yeah. Well, and the difference too is when you have somebody like FDR say, I'm going to make these big changes. He spends a huge amount of time on the radio, not only talking about what the changes are, but
Right.
exactly why,
bringing people
where we're
along.
going, how we're getting there, and he's got a whole logical framework. Whereas this guy is just like tariffs.
Well, he has been much more available to the press, in the first 75 days or whatever.
Availability is not explanation.
What's that?
And
Well,
most
that's
of
the thing
what
is
he
it just
said,
but so the opportunity is there. It's just that the discourse has to get a little bit more.
well, he also has to say something rooted in logic and fact and not pure lies of I believe this thing because I believe this thing, and it goes
Right.
flies against the face of all logic.
Right. Well, and people have been saying, his supporters have been saying, well, he's been saying this, and they're pulling up clips of him telling Oprah, these types of things about tariffs and trade and us being ripped off, when he was a young man. It's like, well, okay, but still, it's just words. I mean, I mean, it's like one line that he's been rehearsing and repeating again and again and again. It's like, okay, so let's see the citations. Let's see the, let's
Where's the backup of why that's a thing? So and when he's saying those things back on Oprah, it's still doing the same thing it's doing now. It's getting him press and
Right.
attention, which is really the only thing that seems to be driving any of his process.
Right,
There's no,
right. But the problem is that, and I'll agree with that criticism of him. The problem is that the other side hasn't been really articulating a case against a lot of this stuff either, except that this is not the way we do things, and this is not the way that we have understood the global economy up to this point. And so to the extent that that is also just based on a set of kind of assumptions and givens.
Yeah.
I think that's equally problematic, that we're just not having a discourse and an actual discussion.
Some of it comes down to language. So the same way that for the last 20 years, if you could understand and write computer programming, you had an edge in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, right now, unless you know economics and can understand and follow through and have some of the math and know what the long-term consequences could be, if you don't know the language of economics, you are totally left out of the.
But other people do. No, Scott Bessent does, and he might be wrong, but at least he might be somebody who could have a conversation about that. I mean, I'm not saying that
and even
what Trump says about
having
this is all there is to be said from that.
Having that ability to do that also requires you to be able to dumb it down for all the rest who have no facility at all, which is generally also wholly missing from the broader conversation. Or everybody is now so enmeshed in their own issues and problems and day to day of just how do I live,
Mhm.
having the time and effort to listen to that conversation and then act on it. Other than just the knee-jerk reaction that happened at the election, there were just enough people in the electorate, that 1.5%, who were like, my gut is this other guy is going to be better for the economy.
Right. Well, and I'm not even really arguing that. I'm not saying that Trump understands this stuff, and I'm not hoping that he does, and I'm not hoping that something's just going to work out because it's Trump or something like that. But what I am questioning is, are these conversations, because Bessent is having conversations, with people like, Chamath and his buddies on the, on the All In podcast. And they're all, tech bros who are doing, who are speaking their inside baseball kind of tech bro language, and based on a bunch of the same assumptions about, sort of the economy and the way it works. They may be wrong, right? But that might be closer to an actual explication of the case than what Trump is doing when he's holding up a board. I mean, that was that moment of him holding up the board in the wind reminded me a lot of there's a famous Reagan speech where he has a chart of the economy behind him, and famously kind of misunderstands economics. And so I'm not looking for the president to be the idea guy or even the best articulator of those ideas. But
well, you've also noticed too, the administration is not pulling out a list of tenured economics professors or, poli sci people saying, here's why. They're
Right.
not, there's no one underpinning any of this, just this is what he said. And that's
Right,
the only,
but the problem is that on the other side, you have there's an equal amount of nonsense, when like Krugman comes out and writes
yeah,
a column. That's equally unhelpful for me.
yeah.
So
Or it would be interesting to have Kate Rayworth say, here's where we get not the soft landing, but here's where we get the landing of the growth plane,
mhm.
at
Yeah.
least, and somebody making some argument for something to give us. And I think the problem is there's no one giving direction. It's just I'm their leader. Which way did they go?
Right, right,
You
right.
know,
Well, and I am, and I am sensitive to the idea that God, we're going over time here, but
Yeah.
I'll crush it down when I edit it. But I mean, we clearly are in the government is in the grip of the plutocracy, right? And the oligarchs are doing what the oligarchs are doing, probably to a great extent for their own purposes, but probably not completely irrationally, right? So at least I think that's a surface on which we can, get a little bit of a purchase and understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and then and maybe I will look at that Stoller article because I typically like Matt Stoller, so hopefully that'll add, that'll kind of continue the conversation. So, but I think we better go. So we'll be off a week. I'm sorry. So we'll be off a week on the 12th, and then we will begin with how much of the plutocrats. I haven't really looked at it. Let me just really briefly quick look. Plutocrats. Looks like it is. Hello. It's got 1, 2, 3. It's got 6 sections, an introduction, 6 sections, and a conclusion. So what if we did the first two, the intro and the first 2 sections? That would be the history of and why it matters, and then the culture of the plutocrats, or those first 2 sections. That would take us about 88 pages into it. Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Then 19th, the first 2 sections of plutocrats. Cool. You've got a. Oh, okay. So yeah. So put something in the notes, in the community notes, if you want to focus us on something. Cool. Thanks a lot. Take care.